Imagine you're in ancient Greece, and you've started acting strangely. You're not sleeping. You're talking to people who aren't there. You're convinced the gods are sending you messages through the pattern of birds flying overhead. Your family is terrified. Your neighbors are whispering, and someone has to decide what happens to you next. Do they call a priest? A physician? Do they lock you away? Do they drill a hole in your skull? Do they sit with you and listen? The answer depends entirely on when and where you're standing. And the range of those answers, from genuinely compassionate to absolutely barbaric, sometimes existing side by side in the same civilization, in the same century, sometimes in the same building, that range is one of the most revealing things about human history that almost nobody talks about. So let's talk about it. Before we get to ancient civilizations with their temples and their texts and their surprisingly sophisticated ideas, we need to go further back, much further back. Because the oldest evidence we have for how humans responded to mental disturbance is sitting in a museum somewhere, and it has a hole in it. Trepanation. The practice of deliberately cutting or drilling a hole into a living human skull. Archaeologists have found examples going back over 7,000 years, and here's the detail that genuinely stops you cold when you hear it. Many of these skulls show bone regrowth around the edges of the hole, which means the patient survived. Someone carved a deliberate opening into another person's head, and that person lived. They walked around afterward with a hole in their skull that was put there on purpose. The most widely accepted explanation is that this was spiritual medicine. Evil spirits, demons, malevolent forces, whatever the local cosmology called them, were understood to be physically inside the suffering person, and if you needed to get something out, you made a door. Simple as that. Headaches, seizures, erratic behavior, voices, visions. Whatever looked like something had gotten inside and taken over, the solution was architectural. Make an exit. What makes this genuinely strange is that trepanation appeared independently across civilizations that had absolutely no contact with each other. Ancient Peru, ancient Egypt, prehistoric Europe, sub-Saharan Africa, the Pacific Islands, completely separate cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, all arriving at the same conclusion. That is either a profound statement about shared human intuition or a deeply unsettling one about shared human problem-solving instincts. Maybe both. Now let's go to Mesopotamia, because Babylon and Assyria give us the first written records of how people understood and responded to mental illness, and the framework they used was logical, internally consistent, and completely wrong in a very specific way. In ancient Mesopotamia, mental illness was a spiritual debt problem. If you were suffering, if your mind was breaking down, if you were hearing things and seeing things and unable to function, it meant you had offended a god. You had broken a sacred law, violated a divine contract, failed some ritual obligation, and now the god whose law you'd broken had placed their hand on you, literally, the hand of a god pressing down on your mind. The specialists who handled this were called Ashipu. Think of them as ancient forensic investigators of the divine. Their job was to figure out which god you'd angered, how badly, and what you needed to do to fix it. They had clay tablet databases, extensive catalogs of symptoms cross-referenced with divine offenses and their prescribed remedies. They observed carefully. They documented systematically. The tablets describe what we would now recognize as depression, mania, psychosis, epilepsy, anxiety. They were watching closely and recording accurately. They just had the cause completely backwards. But here's the thing worth remembering. They were trying to help. They weren't performing cruelty. They were applying the best explanatory framework they had, working methodically within it, and genuinely attempting to relieve suffering. Getting the mechanism wrong while trying sincerely to help is not a Mesopotamian problem. That is a human problem. It shows up in every era, including ours. Egypt moves the needle in a direction that should honestly get more attention than it does. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BC, describes mental and emotional disorders as medical conditions, not purely spiritual ones, medical ones, conditions of the heart and the body that required physical intervention. Egyptian physicians prescribed herbal remedies. They prescribed rest. They prescribed social engagement and meaningful activity. There are records of patients being brought to temple complexes not just for prayer, but for what we might reasonably call environmental therapy. Gardens, music, calming architecture, structured routines designed to quiet an agitated mind. One practice that stands out is called incubation therapy. A distressed person would come to a sacred temple complex, sleep within the precinct, and receive dream interpretations meant to guide their healing. You are being prescribed therapeutic sleep in a peaceful garden environment with professional interpretation of your inner life. That is, without exaggeration, more thoughtful than what many people experiencing mental health crises receive today. Egypt also developed something conceptually close to what we'd now call mood disorders. The idea that the heart could be too full or too empty, emotionally dysregulated in ways that required rebalancing. Wrong anatomy, wrong mechanism, but pointing in the right direction. Across the room from the right answer, but facing it. Ancient Greece is where things get philosophically fascinating, and simultaneously where the contradictions of human civilization are on fullest display. Because Greece didn't have one framework for mental illness, it had two, and they were in direct conflict with each other for centuries. The first framework was divine. Mental illness was communication from the gods. Madness could be a punishment, yes, but it could also be a gift, an opening through which divine truth poured into an ordinary human mind. Oracles were understood to be mentally extraordinary by definition. Plato described four categories of divine madness: prophetic, ritual, poetic, and erotic, and argued that all four represented superior states to ordinary rational thought. In Plato's framework, a completely sane and rational person might actually be spiritually limited. The person experiencing altered states had access to something the merely normal could not reach. That is a genuinely radical position from someone who also essentially invented Western rational philosophy. Plato was holding both things simultaneously. Reason is the highest human faculty. Also, sometimes losing your reason means the gods are talking through you. Ancient Greece contained multitudes. The second framework came from Hippocrates, and it pointed somewhere else entirely. In his text on epilepsy, Hippocrates made an argument that was breathtaking in its implications. Mental disturbances are not divine. They are diseases of the brain. They have physical causes. They can be observed, studied, and treated medically. His specific mechanism was the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance in these physical substances produced mental disturbance. Depression came from excess black bile, which is where we get the word melancholy. Melas, meaning black. Chol, meaning bile. You were literally diagnosed with too much black bile. Was that correct? No, not even close. But the underlying principle, that mental illness has biological roots, that it is a medical condition and not a supernatural judgment, was so far ahead of its time that the Western world would largely abandon it and not return consistently for nearly 2,000 years. Hippocrates was right about the category and wrong about the mechanism. That is still an extraordinary achievement. Rome inherited Greek ideas, improved some, ignored others, and added its own particular contributions, which included both genuine medical advancement and some breathtaking legal cruelty. Roman physicians continued developing the humoral tradition. Galen, the most influential physician of the ancient world, recommended warm baths, exercise, dietary changes, massage, and conversation. Actual conversation. Galen believed that what patients said about their suffering was medically relevant information. You can see the distant outline of psychotherapy taking shape if you squint. But Rome also gave us the furiosus, a legal category meaning madman. A person declared furiosus lost all legal standing. Their property was managed by a guardian. They could be confined. And critically, the decision about who qualified was made by the family and a local magistrate, not a physician. You can immediately see the problem. If your relative was genuinely suffering from severe psychosis, the furiosus declaration might result in care of a kind. But if your relative was rich, and you were their heir, and you were not particularly scrupulous about the difference between madness and inconvenience, well, the law was flexible, the category was broad, the incentives were obvious. Rome built a system that could be weaponized against the vulnerable, by the powerful, and then acted surprised when it was. Now we arrive at the medieval period, and here is where I need to correct something that gets repeated so often it has calcified into assumed fact. The medieval period was not uniformly dark and brutal in its treatment of mental illness. The reality is far more complicated, and in places genuinely astonishing. Yes, demonic possession was the dominant framework in medieval European Christianity. Yes, exorcism was standard treatment. Yes, terrible things happened to people under that framework. That is real, and it should not be minimized. But while medieval Europe was performing exorcisms, medieval Islamic civilization was doing something else entirely. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine in the early 11th century. His framework for mental illness was explicitly medical. He described conditions we would now recognize as depression, mania, anxiety, and what sounds remarkably like obsessive-compulsive disorder. He recommended music therapy, physical exercise, meaningful work, and what he called psychic treatment, using conversation and suggestion to change the patient's mental state. Ibn Sina was describing psychological intervention in 1025 AD, not post-Enlightenment, not Victorian, 1025. And the Islamic world didn't just theorize, they built. The first dedicated psychiatric hospitals in recorded history were built in the Islamic world. Baghdad had one in the 8th century, Cairo in the 9th. Historical accounts describe these facilities with running water, gardens, music, and physicians overseeing care. These were not prisons. They were hospitals with a specific therapeutic philosophy. That history gets left out of most Western accounts of mental health care, and that gap is worth naming directly. Back in medieval Europe, the picture was genuinely mixed. The possession framework dominated theology, but at the community level, ordinary people dealt with mental illness in ways that were often more pragmatic than theological. A person in a village who was clearly disturbed but not dangerous was frequently just incorporated into daily life, known, fed, watched over, not cured, not treated, just included. That informal tolerance was imperfect and hard and offered no real relief from suffering, but it was not the same as persecution. And then there is Geel. Geel is a small town in Belgium. From at least the 13th century, it operated what we would now call a community foster care system for mentally ill individuals. People came as pilgrims seeking healing, and they stayed. Local families took them in. They participated in daily life, working alongside family members, eating at the family table, living as part of the household, not warehoused, not confined, included. This system ran for centuries. It still runs today. Geel, Belgium has an unbroken tradition of community-based mental health care that is over 700 years old. It predates professional psychiatry by half a millennium. If someone proposed a Geel-style model at a mental health conference today, they would be celebrated as visionary. A small Belgian town figured it out in the 1200s and just quietly kept doing it. Then came the early modern period, and Europe built institutions, large-scale confinement facilities that swept up the mentally ill alongside the poor, the criminal, and anyone else deemed inconvenient. The most famous was Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, shortened to Bedlam, a word that entered the English language as a synonym for chaos and disorder. In the 17th century, Bethlehem charged admission for members of the public to come and watch the patients. Sunday entertainment, bring the family, point at the suffering people. This was a popular leisure activity, thousands of visitors annually. The level of collective dissociation required to experience another person's mental anguish as entertainment is itself a form of cultural illness. Something had gone profoundly wrong in how thoroughly these individuals had been stripped of their humanity in the public imagination. The turn came slowly in the 18th century. The Enlightenment brought new emphasis on individual dignity and rational inquiry. Philippe Pinel in France ordered the chains removed from patients at the Bicêtre Asylum in 1793. Arguing that mental illness was a disease that could improve with humane treatment. In England, William Tuke established the York Retreat in 1796, run on the radical premise that kindness, dignity, fresh air, and meaningful activity produced better outcomes than confinement and punishment. It turned out that treating traumatized people humanely rather than brutally led to better mental health outcomes. This was considered a revolutionary discovery in 1796. The 19th century then built enormous asylums, overcrowded them catastrophically, and demonstrated once again that good intentions and institutional systems do not automatically produce good outcomes. The asylum movement started as reform. By mid-century it had become its own form of harm. Here is what the entire arc of this history actually shows. The most humane responses to mental illness throughout history almost never came from the most sophisticated societies or the most advanced theoretical frameworks. They came from communities that simply had no choice but to include their struggling members. From reformers who applied basic empathy against institutional resistance. From a small Belgian town that operated on one quiet, stubborn premise for 7 centuries. That a person whose mind works differently is still a person, still belongs, still contributes. Every era thought it had finally understood. Every era looked back at its predecessors with confident superiority. And every era had its own version of charging admission to watch the suffering. Whether that was literal or institutional or philosophical. We have real treatments now. We have scientific frameworks with genuine validity. We have legal protections that would have been unimaginable in most of the periods we've covered. The knowledge is better than it has ever been. But the gap between what we know and what we actually do with it, the distance between our understanding and the humanity with which we apply it, that gap is not new. It has been there since the first physician removed a patient's chains, and everyone watching thought he was the one who had lost his mind. The knowledge has always run ahead. The humanity has always required fighting for. That is not a historical observation. That is a current one.